right, well, we know folks are going to continue to sign on in the next few minutes, but out of respect for everybody's time, attendees and panelists, I'd love us to get started right now. This is so exciting. Good evening. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for CCF's virtual event, Polls, Priorities in the 2020 Political Landscape for Children. My name is Jess Agi. I am so proud and excited and honored to introduce myself as the newly hired and first ever in our 30-year history Executive Director of Children's Campaign Fund. Today is actually my 1-month anniversary on the job, so this is sort of like a small anniversary party, if we want that. And I know most of you are already quite familiar with CCF's work to elect leaders who will champion the health and well-being and safety of children, youth, and families across Washington, especially those who have been historically marginalized. What you might not know is that we're also the state's longest standing nonpartisan PAC, the oldest statewide PAC for children in the country, and one of only a handful of children's PACs nationwide. So we truly cannot do this work without you, and I just cannot thank you enough for being here tonight and supporting CCF. So I'm just going to spend a couple minutes quickly up top to go through the technology tonight and how we're going to be using Zoom, introduce you to the team that is making this event possible, and then we'll dive into the panel because that is the reason you all are here. So a little bit of virtual housekeeping. We're going to keep everybody but our speakers muted for tonight's event, so we cannot hear you. The chat feature is going to be your best friend. If you have any questions, any technological needs, any thoughts you want to share with the group, just utilize that chat feature if you're on your computer or device. And we'll also have time after the moderated panel to take audience questions. So feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Any questions for any of the panelists that come up at any point tonight. So we'll be monitoring that. I am very grateful to be joined tonight by Hikma Sherka, the phenomenal PAC manager who joined the CCF staff in March of 2019. Hikma and I are here to support all of the panelists and all of you attendees. So if you need any tech help, anything wonky with your Zoom is going on, feel free to send a message to Hikma in the chat. And then she's also going to be posting relevant links in the chat all night, so you can keep an eye out for those. And like I mentioned before, if you're calling in, any relevant links or resources that we share in the chat will also send out via email tomorrow. So if you're calling in, you won't miss anything. Cool. I'm also excited to welcome Juan Cotto, a true community leader who has been on the CCF board for about 2 years. We're going to hear from him a little bit later on in the program about why your support is so crucially important right now. And he's going to invite you to deepen your commitment to CCF. So on behalf of the entire leadership team here at CCF, thank you for joining us for tonight's virtual event. For our panel, again, the very reason we are here, we are thrilled to be joined by Molly O'Rourke, national pollster and partner at Heart Research, who is joining us from the East Coast. Thank you for staying up a little bit late tonight to be here with us, Molly. We've got Stuart Elway, owner of Elway Research, Inc. And we've got Cy Salmoneni, campaign manager and South Sound community consultant. And we're going to learn a lot more about our amazing guests in just a few minutes, so sit tight and we're going to let them take it away. So I am, of course, deeply honored to introduce tonight's moderator. You know her, you love her, former Representative Ruth Kagi. For decades, Ruth has been a leader in the state and the country in advocating for early learning and childcare, truly a formidable force on these issues. After serving for 20 years in the Washington state legislature, she recommitted to CCF, an organization that she co-founded 30 years ago and stepped in as co-chair earlier this summer. Ruth was a pioneer in educating the legislature and the public about the critical importance of early childhood development. She chaired the House Early Learning and Human Services Committee from 2002 to 2018. She sponsored the Early Start Act and was the primary architect of the new State Department of Children, Youth, and Families. So Ruth, we are all deeply, profoundly grateful for your leadership and cannot wait to hear more from you and our panelists tonight. Take it away, Ruth, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jess. And it is so wonderful to have you on board as our new executive director. And thank you to Hikma you and Hikma for doing a great job setting this up. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. This conversation is so timely, nearly 5 weeks before the election, because it is so critical to elect champions for children to the legislature in this session they're facing, where they are going to have to make cuts. CCF over the past several months has interviewed 100 candidates. We've endorsed 73 and have contributed 53,000 to campaigns. So the timing is really critical, as ballots will drop October 16th. And we're really hoping you will be inspired to invest in these races so that we can have a very strong legislature for children when it convenes. I'm excited to introduce our terrific panelists tonight, who will each tell you a little bit more about themselves and their perspectives. We'll look at what the polls and data are telling us, primarily about 3 key issues: accessible, affordable childcare, family homelessness and food insecurity, and digital equity and education. While there are many issues, as you know, of concern regarding children, youth, and families, these are the 3 we've chosen to focus on tonight. And finally, at the end, we will, as Jess mentioned, have time for you to ask questions of our panelists. So with that, let's dive in. First, I'd like to introduce Molly O'Rourke. Jess mentioned she's a partner at Heart Research and has been with the company for over 15 years. She directs research projects for a variety of advocacy and nonprofit organizations, political candidates, parties, and media outlets. She's also the director of the graduate program in political communication at American University. Molly, thank you so much for being here with us this evening and sharing your insights and expertise. To begin with, can you tell us how you're seeing the policy conversation play out at the presidential campaign level and what impact the pandemic is having on that conversation?
Sure. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I so admire your work. I find it astonishing that you're the only PAC in the country devoted to children and family issues, and I hope that you're inspiring work in states around the country, as I know you are. I'll say briefly, just to expand on kind of how I come at this. As you said, I'm a partner at Heart Research. We direct the polling for NBC News and the Wall Street Journal, which is a bipartisan effort. And then our company has a political division that does work for Democratic candidates and for progressive advocacy organizations. I've been fortunate enough in my time at Heart to work for, I think, some of the greatest clients doing really important work, including the Children's Defense Fund and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, First Five California, and others. Most recently, we've completed national surveys for Caring Across Generations, a caregiver devoted organization, and for the First 5 Years Fund. And I'm going to reference some of those findings from those surveys in my remarks. As you said, the other hat that I wear is the director of the master's program at American University in political communication. And for me, that's a great perch to be inspiring kind of the next generation of advocates, because we certainly need them in today's world. My kind of thoughts about more an overview of how children and the agenda around children and families issues is playing out in the presidential campaign from both the perspective of the candidates, but also from the perspective of voters. Obviously, the pandemic has exposed challenges and barriers that children and families face in a way that no other event, frankly, ever has. And what it has done in a lot of ways, I think, is kind of take what was maddeningly dismissed as private or individual challenges around childcare and put them out in full public view for a really robust policy conversation. I have a group of friends who we kind of tracked the explosion of news pieces devoted to this issue of the childcare crisis in the era of coronavirus. And one of my favorite quotes from a Washington Post column, that the novel coronavirus has both expanded and exacerbated the childcare crisis in this country. May it also compel our elected officials to act, and act soon, if not for working parents, then for our economy. And I think that sort of gives a sense of the multiple imperatives that we face here now around childcare. So before I get into kind of the current crisis in terms of the situation with COVID, let me back up and say that I think we started the presidential campaign this year on a hopeful note. Back in February, Elizabeth Warren announced a major childcare initiative as one of her foundational campaign platforms in a way that really no other major presidential candidate has done. And her doing that really forced the other candidates to then step up and put forward a plan of their own. And so it really launched a conversation early on about this issue in a way that we just haven't seen in presidential campaigns. In the summer, Biden put out his, I think it was the third plank of his Build Back Better platform, which was, you know, a over $700 billion initiative that was built around tax credits for childcare construction, for businesses to build facilities at work, tax credits for low income and middle class families to cover childcare costs. And so this has been a real substantive part of the conversation in this presidential year in a way that I think we just haven't seen before. And I think the policy emphasis is really important, and it's been a real breakthrough. But another thing that, you know, I think is important is that the candidates themselves have spoken to this issue in a very personal way. And I think that's been very validating and compelling, because it provides a credential or an educational purpose when candidates speak to this. So, you know, Joe Biden, a man, has talked about being a single parent and having the luxury of resources of family to help him raise his young children, and how that's given him an opportunity to kind of empathize with and prioritize childcare issues that millions of American families face. And we heard Elizabeth Warren throughout the campaign kind of expressing her gratitude to her Aunt Bee for stepping in and helping her through the years in a way that I think for a lot of Americans, it takes this conversation out of the shadows, that each family should just kind of figure this out for themselves, and puts it in a public realm where it belongs, when candidates are willing to kind of leverage their own personal experience to tell their story. And so I think that's been another really validating part of the presidential campaign. The connection between how this is playing out at the presidential level in terms of the policy debate and how voters are experiencing it. It was the fifth debate of the presidential season, right on the eve of the Iowa caucus, the first time that this issue around childcare, or really any issue around children and families, was raised in the debate. So that was, I think, somewhat depressing that it was the fifth debate by the time we really got to this. But it was a town hall, tellingly, where a voter asked a very pointed question of the candidates around childcare. And I think we heard the candidates on stage for the first time. It was a real area of agreement for the Democratic candidates. And so I think that was a breakthrough too. I mentioned earlier that we've done several surveys. There's really been dozens of surveys over the past 6 months in terms of measuring the impact of COVID on kind of the collapse of the childcare system, and from measuring it from ways including family stress levels, the negative impact it's having on children's development, their overlooked needs, to the economic impacts for businesses. And I think all of these ways in which public opinion research is exploring the impact of childcare crisis, I think that's also a real opportunity because it brings multiple stakeholders to the table and invites a conversation, I think that's more inclusive than it ever has been. The two polls that I just wanted to cite briefly in terms of the work that we've done, I mentioned some research that we've done for caring across generations. We asked people about their view of whether government should be doing more to help people solve problems or government is already doing too much of things that are better left to individuals and businesses. And we found, interestingly, this was in April or late April, after coronavirus had set in, that about 70% of Americans, which was a new high, this is kind of a tracking measure, that about 70% of Americans said government needs to be doing more to help solve problems instead of leaving them up to individuals. But then we took that question and we asked specifically about childcare. So childcare is both these were the two statements, childcare is both an individual and social responsibility that the federal government should become more involved in supporting, versus childcare as an individual family responsibility and the federal government should not be doing more. And it was a real breakthrough for us that more than 70% of Americans said, no, childcare is both an individual and a social responsibility. And I think just having that kind of shared commitment was very validating. And then most recently, and I think we're going to share the release of the poll results that we've just done for the first 5 years fund. And it was just put out last week. They're just really stunning results here about the high priority that voters are putting on childcare, given the amazing consequences that it's having. But the key takeaway for me, 83% of voters in battleground states say that candidates for office, including candidates for president, they expect them to have plans and policies to help parents afford quality childcare. And then when we ask the statement, high quality, affordable childcare for families with young children is an essential service, just like healthcare and education, that's a pretty high bar that we're asking people to sign on to. 84% of voters agree with that statement. I don't think we would have found that before kind of coronavirus put all of these challenges out in such public and socially visible ways. And so, you know, I think the devastating consequences that we've seen around the impact of COVID on childcare and the collapse of the childcare system has also provided us with a brand new conversation and opportunities. So just a few kind of nuggets of data, and I'll be happy to kind of return to those and expand on them a little more.
Well, thank you. And, you know, at least there appears to be a silver lining to this pandemic in the awareness that it's bringing to people of how critical childcare is and the impact of the pandemic. Thank you, Molly. Next, I'd like to introduce my friend Stuart Elway, owner of Elway Research. Since 1992, he has published the Elway Poll, a nonpartisan independent analysis of public opinion in the Northwest. In 2018, the Elway Poll partnered with Crosscut to become the Crosscut Elway Poll. And in the 2016 election cycle, Elway Research was one of only 6 firms in the entire country with an A+ rating from Nate Silver's 538.com. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little more about yourself and the polling you have done on children and families and your perspective?
Sure. Thank you, Ruth, and I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. We started, as Ruth mentioned, the Elway poll in 1992. I was doing before that the Seattle Times Washington poll from 1984. When they stopped doing that, I wanted to keep going, so that's how we formed the Elway poll in 92. I've been doing research, public opinion research in Washington, the Northwest, and across the country since 1975, which sort of staggers me when I hear myself say that out loud, how long that's been. But one of the things I want to get to a poll that we did last year, and specifically go through that, but just sort of tagging on what Molly was talking about. One of the things we do in the Elway poll every year is in January, we publish the public agenda for the coming legislative session. What do you think the legislature should be focusing on? And for the last 2 years, and particularly last year, the number one category of issues was social services, which childcare and those kind of issues are in that category. 2 years ago, that category was at, this is an open-ended question, so it's just top of mind mention. That category was at 7%. For the last session this year, it was at 33%, topping taxes and economy, which are always at the top. So there's been quite a change. And that we have to keep in mind is pre-COVID. And as Molly and Ruth have pointed out, the pandemic has exposed so many, I don't know if it's fissures in so many different systems in this country that brought them into relief that we took for granted before. Just name it, the economic system, the electoral system, social services systems, all those have been put under this spotlight of the COVID pandemic in ways that make us see the interconnections and some of the weaknesses that we never saw before. We took it for granted. And childcare is certainly near the top of that list because, for example, this whole emphasis of, well, we got to get kids back to school. And the second part of that is so their parents can go back to work. That's the main thing, from say Trump's perspective, but it does show the necessity of childcare for the economic system, as well as just the benefit of the children and the parents. So we did a survey last year.
I'm going to be asking you more about the specifics of that parent survey in a minute.
Oh, okay.
But thank you very much. And I want to turn to Sai Semineni, and we're thrilled to have you tonight. And I want to get your perspective based on your experiences on the campaign trail, as well as relevant data and insights from community projects that you've designed and worked on. Can you tell us more about yourself and what you're hearing on the campaign trail about issues affecting children, youth, and families, and what you're seeing as voter priorities?
Yeah, definitely. So I could not get myself to watch the full debate last night, but I did see enough to be able to be literate today. And I thought it was really interesting that on the right, for me, what captured that debate was this message to stand down and stand by. And then on the left, Biden said, I am the Democratic Party, not the radical left agenda. And that left me wondering about who wasn't on that stage or being represented. And that's this sandwich generation that Molly is talking about, who they're struggling with childcare burden and the childcare crises or inequities collapsing. But at the same time, they're struggling with elder care burden and aging in place. And the outcomes for this sandwich generation, they're really quite horrific. We talk about children and elders, but it's really when it comes to mental health, personal well-being, chronic diseases, that this sandwich generation is fast rising. And I'm going to be a part of that sandwich generation in 5 years. And so if we want to really delve into children's issues on a true level, then we need to recognize that not all children are dealing with only one pandemic. So we have the visible spotlight public health pandemic of COVID that children, but especially low-income children, are dealing with. But then we have a second pandemic of institutional racism. And then finally, African American children, but primarily other non-white families of color, are dealing with the effects of police brutality in their community. And so when we're talking about children's issues, what I'm hearing on the pandemic or on the campaign trail with regard to these three issues is that a good legislator will address COVID and remedy the poverty-related pandemic stressors that are affecting students and children, whether that's lack of access to technology, lack of access to internet. But a great legislator will address both COVID and the underlying institutional racism that's driving the fissures and collapse of systems. And so we have to ask ourselves, if everybody is paying taxes, but the racial inequities are showing that communities of color are not benefiting from what they pay into the system, whether it's in childcare resources or agencies that are led by people of color being funded to provide those basic essential necessities in their community, then what does that mean for us being able to move forward? And I think a phenomenal legislator will address COVID, institutional racism, and the lack of safety in our community. So that means even if a Black and Brown family is at risk of COVID and not getting their essential resources met, at least at a minimum, they can rely that there's safety and security in their community. And those words, what safety and security means for families that don't have racial privilege, when we talk to them on the campaign trail, is very different than the experience of those children who are just dealing with COVID alone.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that perspective. We were planning to start out the follow-up questions with a question to each of you about the presidential debate and issues around children and families that were raised in the debate. And of course, the debate really didn't deal with much policy or issues that are of concern or that directly address children and families. And hopefully no children were watching the debate. But these issues are critically important to families and to voters. So I think the question to you, Molly, is what are you seeing in your polling of what issues are of importance and rising to the top for voters around children and families?
So the childcare crisis, I think, is predominant for the reasons that Stuart and Sai have mentioned. I mean, voters come at this for different, they prioritize it for different reasons, and I think that's fine. They don't all have to be wanting to solve the childcare crisis for the exact same reason in order to kind of be on our side. So as Stuart mentioned, a lot of people are saying, you know, just for the sake of getting the economy back together again, we've got to fix this broken childcare system. Some are coming at it more from the perspective of the inequities that have been revealed in how families are and are not able to afford to kind of bootstrap together a quality childcare program or a quality childcare plan for their kids and for their families. So I think childcare is an opportunity that we have like no other, and I think the next Congress will be hopefully have a lot of kind of momentum. And I know from what candidates are hearing out, you know, on the campaign trail, they will come back to Washington after having been elected, in some cases re-elected, I think with those conversations with voters fresh in mind. And so I think there's real legislative momentum in Congress for there to be some significant investments in childcare. But, you know, I also think that related issues around homelessness and food insecurity are follow closely behind. I think Stuart said this, Americans are starting to kind of understand the interconnectedness of these issues and these vulnerabilities, and seeing that, oh, you know, children are especially vulnerable to food insecurity when schools are closed, because that's, you know, been a significant resource for how we ensure that students have adequate nutrition. I think that there are a lot of academic studies going on right now. The Urban Institute, Brookings, they're doing a lot to kind of document food insecurity among children in COVID. And I think a lot of that is sort of momentum that's happening among the advocacy community, knowing that when Congress comes back in January, that there will be a lot of kind of hard evidence to be able to push forward these pretty significant investments. So Ruth, as you said, well, nobody would ever wish these circumstances. They've been horrible for the country and for the world. I think there is kind of a renewed commitment to address them in a more fundamental and holistic way that has lasting impact, rather than kind of patching a Band-Aid on a system that is revealed to be so structurally broken. And you know, and that is, it's not even a silver lining, as I said, because nobody would sort of want to think of it that way. But I think it is an opportunity for us as an advocacy community to finally have attention on systems that serve children and families that are fundamentally broken around childcare, around homelessness, around food security, around, you know, other resources, the digital access issues, Ruth, that you mentioned. Those have become visible in a way that Americans can tell stories about neighbors, about seeing it in their communities and in neighborhoods. You know, and I think we've got to, you know, we've got to use that opportunity to really propel that conversation.
Well, and the tremendous inequities that it has revealed. I mean, the pandemic, I think, has really put a spotlight on the inequities in our system. Thank you. Well, Stuart, I know last year, as you mentioned, Elway Research did a parent survey to determine the impact of childcare on their employment and on our economy. And I was wondering if you could tell us about that survey and what some of the bottom line takeaways were from your work.
Sure. So we conducted a survey of 400 households with children under the age of 6, so five years and under. We did the survey, and then the results were further analyzed by the Institute for Public Policy and Economic Analysis at Eastern Washington University. The survey was conducted by phone, online, and text. Every way we could find to get people. Most of them were online. So first, it's useful to know that workers with children under 6 years old represent 15% of Washington State's workforce. And in 60% of the households with children under 6, all available parents work. So it's no small thing. And this was intended to look at economic impact. So I'll get to some of those, but just some of the top line findings. Half of the parents we talked to, 49%, said it was difficult or very difficult or very difficult to find health care. 27% had quit their job or left school or some training due to healthcare issues.
Childcare.
I'm sorry, yes, childcare issues. 9% were fired or let go due to childcare issues in their reporting. Almost 3 in 10 went from full-time to part-time work, school, or training due to childcare issues. When looking for childcare, 75% of the people of these households we talked to had sought or used childcare. So certainly vast majority. Half of those who looked found no openings near their home or work. 37% did not find childcare nearby them that fit their work schedule. Fully a third did not find nearby childcare of decent quality for them. 12% didn't find nearby care that accepted childcare subsidies. They needed those. So 20, and then beyond that, once they're in work and in their careers, 29% declined a job or a promotion because of childcare issues. 27% reduced their hours from full-time to part-time. 9% left school or training. 18% quit their job. 9% were fired or let go because of these issues. And then even beyond that, 59% arrived late or left early in the last 6 months due to childcare issues, so lost time on the job. 48% missed an average of 5 days of work or school in the last 6 months. So it's no small number of people who are affected by this. And when Eastern put these numbers together with extrapolated those into the population, they determined that all those things I just talked about contributed to a loss in the state's gross domestic product of about $6.5 billion in 1 year. So as we talked about earlier, you can make the economic argument just as strongly as any other argument. That is a $6.5 billion loss to the economy directly related to childcare issues.
And that was pre-COVID.
And that was pre-COVID. I shudder to think what these numbers would be if we replicated this survey now. And I think this survey is going to be, a link to it will be in the follow-up email for this, so that you can read it in more detail.
Well, and I believe it will be in the chat box.
Okay, great.
So this past winter, Tim Burgess and I went on a tour of chambers of commerce with the Association of Washington Business to talk about your parent survey and to really educate business about the impact that childcare is having on their bottom line. And businesses are really understanding that this is a bottom line issue for them and are paying attention and starting to try to address this issue in a way that I certainly haven't seen in the last 20 years. So it's very encouraging that they are engaging, and it's very discouraging how COVID has really exacerbated that impact. And in Washington, 20% of childcare providers have closed, and many more are in danger of closing because parents aren't putting their children into childcare. So thank you very much, Stuart. Sai, you're very involved in politics and policy at the local level. From your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of the legislative campaigns and how they're addressing children's issues, including childcare, food insecurity, and access to technology?
Definitely. This is a huge part of both Representative Entenmann's campaign platform, but I'm excited that we're finally getting to a place where there's more women of color and women running for office. And so those gender ceilings, the work that you, Jeannie Darnell, the representatives who are the all-stars and MVPs, those hard conversations that you had to lay the groundwork is now allowing the next generation of women in office and empowered men who want to support those women to have these conversations. And what I'm seeing on the ground is that one issue is this persistent collapse or crises, and the fact that COVID is really exposing that. But the other issue is that we never really had quality or accessibility to begin with. So one of our key on the ground community partners is Operation Sack Lunch, ran by a powerhouse of an ED, Beverly Graham. They've been the emergency food backbone services provider for the city of Seattle for about 30 years. And OSL has been working on food security issues for a while, but recently they've had to ramp up to producing 10,000 meals a day to support 70 food crisis sites, of which it's a combination of serving homeless individuals, but also housing unstable families in the Othello tiny homes community. And there's really this question of that this idea of building better really is germane, that we just had Band-Aids and Post-it notes and gum holding our social safety nets together. And COVID came, and then it just kind of crashed on top of it. So I think it is very saddening and disheartening how much loss and grief that we've had in our country. But honestly, this is a big moment of reckoning for us. Are we going to go back to the way things were, having systems that are ineffective and barely holding us in good stead? Or are we going to acknowledge that if we're going to be a healthy, economically stable society that moves into the 22nd century economy in a way where we're not burdened by these issues, that we're going to make the changes that we need? And then in addition to that, I think it's exciting to me that childcare is now a conversation that men have, because this whole situation has gotten so bad that it's affecting everybody. And so what I used to hear when people would talk about the future of the workforce, upskilling people, we're talking about like the high-tech economy, all these jobs that will bring us into the STEM workforce. But now people are like, oh my gosh, what about the caregivers? Who are the caregivers? It's so inconvenient to have poorly trained, underpaid caregivers, because it's affecting my economic bottom line, my business outcomes. So now I'm hearing both Governor Inslee, but others who had not historically mentioned childcare, training caregivers, brain science, all of these investments that are generally considered women's work and not worthy of investment as a nation, now really coming to the forefront, because everyone from the smallest household to the largest politician is being affected. And we're seeing legislators in the most human form that they've ever been, like people breastfeeding while they're running policy meetings. And that's just because children are now a conversation that we need to have as a nation, because COVID has forced us to recognize the importance of caregiving and building better systems.
Well, the Children's Campaign Fund, in the endorsement interviews that we've done, we add a question about childcare and early learning, a question about food insecurity, and a question about access to technology. And there is very strong support for providing funding to assure that children and families get the resources they need, and for raising the revenue to do that. So it really was very encouraging doing those interviews and seeing exactly what you're saying, that there is a growing awareness, and I think coming together about the needs of children and families and their priority. So we are very fortunate tonight to have a rich combination of elected officials and child advocates and community leaders and parents on this call. And I'd like to ask each of you, what takeaway message would you like people to leave with today about children and families, and messages that people in our community should be putting to our elected officials, or that you're hearing from the public?
I can jump in and start. I guess I feel like I would say that the pandemic has put us in a moment in this country in terms of children and family issues being in such stark relief that we have momentum and opportunity and new stakeholders at the table. Stuart and Cy and Ruth, you've mentioned this too. I think from a Washington or from a DC perspective, having business engaged in this conversation they have real skin in the game now in solving this. And that is a critical development that we've been seeking for years. And it's always been sort of on the periphery of a commitment, but I think now it's a real kind of all-in commitment to figuring out how employees are going to return back to work effectively and constructively in the long term. It's not going to happen without the engagement of business leaders and kind of new stakeholders. And so my takeaway message is that this isn't, it's not the same old fight. There are new people at the table. They need to be educated about these issues. I mean, they understand the impact because they're seeing it, but they don't have all the background that we know from our years of experience of kind of been doing this work. But the conversation, I just think, is ripe for opportunity for so many different reasons, and to kind of appreciate this new coalition that we have and to welcome it. And to really leverage it. People are in this conversation for lots of different reasons. And we don't, as I said, all have to be in it for the exact same reason. But to be able to make progress, I think, is a common goal. And I think the country is really, really eager to be, making progress on common constructive agenda. And I think childcare represents one of those opportunities. So I'm hopeful, but I also think we have to be really mindful of how we make progress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Stuart, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I can't add much to that. We've all talked about how this pandemic has really created an opportunity. It's the old saw, a crisis is an opportunity on the other side of the same coin. Molly has said it very well. I would just add that if the polls are right, chances are there'll be a more sympathetic atmosphere at the national level, and at the state level, it's pretty good now, but it could get better. So I think the tenor, we hope, of the national conversation is going to change also, which will allow the discussion of this to take place in a more civilized and productive manner. We're hopeful.
Hope.
We're hopeful.
Inside, you have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think maybe I'm crazy, but I'm going to echo Stuart and Molly's hopeful tone. And this is one of the few areas where right, left, whatever your political view is, I think we can all agree that it's important to stand together and leave no one behind. And this is an area where we can follow through on the policy promises and recognize that if we can't take care of the most vulnerable members or the most needing care units in our society, then there's really not much more that we can do. And so I'm really hopeful that childcare being a conversation that's central, but also associated importance of housing stability and food security for the family unit to function so that workers can be whole and contributing to the economy. That's something that we all want. And if we want to win in that way, then I think we need to achieve these goals that we have set before us.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for this really insightful conversation and hopeful. I mean, it really is hopeful. And I have to say, participating in many of the interviews for Children's Campaign Fund, I am hopeful. We do have so many candidates of color who are just outstanding, and so many individuals who really understand issues around children, youth, and families, and want to go to the legislature to fight for them. So I think it is a moment where children, youth, and families may be at the center of many of these races. With that, I want to turn it back to Jess. I think she's going to introduce Juan.
Absolutely. And just thank you so much again. I mean, Molly, Cy, Stuart, it is such a gift for us to get to hear from you and engage in this very substantive, productive, rich conversation. And just looking at the clock, we want to respect everybody's time. But Molly, Cy, and Stuart, if there's any chance you can stay on just a couple extra minutes. I know we've got a few questions from the audience that we want to get to. So if there's any chance you could stay on a few extra minutes, we would be so, so, so grateful. And same with the folks who have tuned in tonight. I know we said right to 6, but we've got more to cover tonight. So if you could stay on a little bit longer, that would be wonderful. And before we get to that Q&A, we have a few sponsors that we want to thank who helped make this event possible tonight. We are so deeply grateful for their support. Richard and Janet Olin and Alexandra Brookshire, truly thank you so much for your generosity and your partnership. And now I am so happy to be joined by Juan Cotto, one of our game-changing board members, as I mentioned earlier. Juan currently works as the Director of Social Impact at Bloodworks Northwest. He also serves on the Sound Mental Health Advisory Committee and the boards of Amara, Seattle Urban League, Seattle Pony League Baseball, and El Centro de la Raza. Juan has served on our board for about 2 years, and he would like to share a few words about why your support for Children's Campaign Fund is so crucially important right now. So Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jess. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us tonight at this event, this informative event. We're all here because we care about making a better, brighter, and more just future for kids and families across the state of Washington. We don't want you to wake up the day after the election wishing you had done more to make a difference, as if last night wasn't motivation enough. This is your chance right now to make sure you can do all that and more. You're here because you care. And you've just heard from Ruth, Molly, Stuart, and Cy, you were remarkable, about just how much is at stake. Can we count on your support today, right now, to give as generously as you can to elect champions to the state legislature? If you've already gave before today's event, you can dig even deeper, please, and donate again. Can you stretch your impact and set your gift as a recurring monthly gift throughout the campaign? Can you invite your friends to join? We're going to post a link to donate in the chat. We really appreciate your support at such a critical time for children, youth, and families throughout Washington State. On behalf of the board of the Children's Campaign Fund, thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. We do have a few questions, and Molly, the first one is for you. The question comes from someone who works with kinship providers. They like the child care poll that you shared as it frames the results as child care for families. Is that how the question was asked and how the results are usually presented? Because they work with a lot of grandparents and other relatives who are raising children but find that child care is often framed as an issue for parents. And these caregivers often read parents as not including them.
Right. So I think that's a really, that's a great question and a great point. The poll that I was citing that we did was for an organization, Caregiving Across Generations. And it is, so we were very mindful because we were working with our client to be framing the questions around family caregiving, which is not limited to caring just for young children. As you know, Ty pointed out earlier too, involves elder care and involves grandparents caring for young children. So it involves kind of more than just a traditional maybe image of a caregiving situation of parents, two parents caring for, or thinking about care for young children, but involves grandparents, and it also involves care for elder members of the family. So yes, actually support increases for policies when you frame them more broadly. And that's not necessarily intuitive. Sometimes the thinking is the picture that we should be portraying is only or exclusively about young children, because they, are kind of obviously in need of care and compelling. But when you expand the conversation to talk about the real needs that families face, especially again, I think in this pandemic, understanding that older generations need different kinds of care and that they also provide care for young children. So framing the question more broadly around caregiving in families and how that crosses different generations actually expands the opportunity to have a broader conversation.
Good, well, that's encouraging. The second question is for Cy. You're both a campaign manager and a policy consultant. Thinking about the life cycle of a campaign, a candidate takes data from polls to learn about voter priorities, develops a campaign platform based on those priorities, and voters then vote for a candidate based on that platform. How do you connect voter priorities during a campaign season to legislative priorities during session to influence policy outcomes? Put another way, how do we hold elected officials accountable for their campaign promises?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm honestly learning all of this because prior to this year, I did not even know what a PCO was and the importance. So this is my first year campaign managing, doing heavy policy work, and being a PCO. I just decided to do it all at once. And I think how I like to describe it is, if politics ran more like football, that would be better. We have the on season, the Super Bowl. Everybody cares about the Super Bowl. Hundreds of people are there. All the lobbyists in town come, and it's that jam-packed 60 days where the Super Bowl happens. But unlike politicians, athletes do what they're supposed to do in the off season too. And I think what I learned is, especially with this Get Out the Vote campaign, we're teaching people that you get an A on the course by just showing up on exam day. So do show up on exam day by or before November 4th, because we can't fail this course and do another 4 years of this. But once you show up for exam day, I think it's important that we need to do a better job of letting people know that it's not just about the Super Bowl. Like, the other 10 months of the year matter too. And that's where we can really start holding candidates accountable. So between the previous legislative session and the next filing date is actually when you want face time with your candidate, because they're not raising money. I don't think people understand how stressful the campaign season is. And so when you go to a candidate during campaign season, you're basically asking them things 10 seconds before they have to go to the Super Bowl. And that's very stressful. So we need to create a culture where we do have more town halls like this, where we do recognize that just like we support, train, and resource athletes so that they can do well at the Super Bowl, we need to be doing that with our candidates too. We can't just approach them during campaign season, show up for the exam on voting day, and then just not show up to school the rest of the time and then hope that we're going to have positive outcomes. So I think figuring out what consistent engagement beyond just voting is extremely important. And then the second thing, I think we only think about politics on that high level, presidential elections, governors, etc. But a lot of the really important groundbreaking building work happens with precinct committee officers, with your city council people. So when you think of the word candidate, if you're just thinking of state legislators or the president, there's a lot in between that are opportunities that are being lost. go get coffee with your city council person. Like, they can tell you a lot, and they're going to care more about you because they share a zip code or a few zip codes away from you than your poor legislator who's trying to do the best that they can for the whole state of Washington. Better yet, ask your city council person, what can you do for me to go talk to our state legislators so that we're doing a better job taking care of our city and neighborhood? So I think that's where I would start. And I don't want to, like, be preaching to the choir, because I'm figuring this out as we go along together. So.
Well, you are right on. After 20 years in the legislature, my bottom line is relationships make the place work, and relationships with constituents is how issues get put forward and addressed. So thank you. Well, thank you again to all three of you. It really has been a productive and hopeful conversation, and I really appreciate that, especially tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jess.
All right, my friends, we just have a few final minutes together, and I just cannot express enough gratitude to our amazing panelists and Ruth as our moderator. This was such a dreamy, insightful conversation. I wish you could have seen me furiously writing down notes on just about everything that you were saying tonight. So before we log off, just the reason that we're all here, we really want to encourage you in these critical, crucial final weeks of the election cycle to connect with your local legislative district races and the candidates that we've endorsed. You can check out our website to see the full list and locations of candidates that we've endorsed. There's a link to the legislative district finder if you want to confirm your district. Hikma's going to put all that in the chat so you have easy access to it. And really, again, just everybody, please join me in thanking our amazing panelists, Molly, Cy, and Stuart, for such an insightful and productive conversation, for our amazing co-chair Ruth for so brilliantly moderating this conversation, for Juan, who so passionately invited you to deepen your commitment tonight. And I've seen some donations come through already. Thank you all so much. To Hikma for co-piloting and co-producing tonight's event. Just could not have done this without you. And although you didn't see them on screen tonight, I do want to thank Susan Weiss, who has served on CCF's board for 30 years, because tonight's event would not have been possible without her tireless dedication. And I want to thank Andy Clark, our phenomenal co-chair, who many of you already know. He goes above and beyond for CCF in a million different ways, and for all of his work behind the scenes tonight, and also for all of our endorsements to date. And like we had briefly mentioned earlier at the start of the conversation, we do hope that you'll join us in 2021. We're going to be launching a new monthly series of virtual conversations, deeper dives into some of the topics covered tonight, with more local leaders and experts, and also topics and critical issues that we did not get to cover tonight. There are many, like juvenile justice reform, K-12 learning outcomes, special education, and more. And we really want to hear from you about the programming that you would like to see. So let's be in touch. Please follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter, let us know what's on your heart and mind. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for your generous commitment to our mission. Please take good care of yourselves, and we will see you again real soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.